Hello, this Dating the Old Testament video is on the books of Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. Let me share my screen. Okay, we'll start with the cover there, which shows the very famous passage in Ecclesiastes about for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. The reason that I am putting Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon together is because really for both those books, as far as the subject of dating them comes, it's the same story for both. And for both, there are competing views. The first view is that they were written by Solomon, so that would place them about 950 BC, pretty old. And the second view is that they're late post-exilic books written more than 500 years later. So very great difference in the two views. And so as I go through this, I'll tell you why I favor the first view, that they were written by Solomon, and then I'll tell you why there's a significant problem with my perspective on that. So this video will be a little bit different from most of the others that I've done, because in the end, I don't have a really firm conclusion about this, but I'll go ahead and present the information and you can see what I mean. Song of Solomon. This is really attributed to Solomon. It says the very first book says first verse says the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, and it mentions Solomon in a number of other verses. Song of Solomon has no problem whatsoever with the idea of 60 queens and 80 concubines. Now, much later, that would have been unbearable, but it's Solomon's time, of course, that's the sort of thing that happened. So that's a pretty good evidence that the authorship ought to be dated to the time of Solomon. There's favorable Egyptian connections. You get the idea that maybe the Shulamite, who is the dark-skinned female lover in the book, is connected to Pharaoh's daughter, and other favorable Egyptian mentions like Pharaoh's chariots. There are lots of other times in the biblical period where Pharaoh's chariots would not have had a favorable connotation, but Solomon had a marriage alliance with Egypt, and so relations were good with them at that time. So that matches Solomon's time too. Let's look at a few of the places that are mentioned in Song of Solomon. It mentions many, many places, as if the author gets to travel around and see all of these places. This is the list of places. The red ones that I've highlighted there are the places in Judah. So in the post-exilic period, a Jew might have pretty easy access to Jerusalem and En Gedi down there in the Judean desert near the Dead Sea. But everywhere else, maybe I should have highlighted everywhere else. Everywhere else is outside of Judah. Quite a few of those places are not just outside Judah, they're in Samaria, which would have been the northern kingdom of Israel. And a few of them are outside of Israel proper, like Damascus, where for most of the biblical period, that would have been the capital of an enemy country, but it seems to be no issue at all for the author here in this book. And that would have been true in Solomon's time, but not at other times. And let me draw your attention specifically to this one. Tirzah is mentioned in 6:4, Song of Solomon 6:4, and Tirzah was the first capital of northern Israel. A place not mentioned in the book is Samaria. And Samaria was later built by Omri, the king of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel. But see, it wasn't built when Solomon was alive. So that's an argument for by absence. But it seems like the book is familiar with Tirzah, but not Samaria. So it's another argument really for it being written during the period of Solomon. Ecclesiastes, it's sort of the same kind of thing. The author there is identified as the preacher, the son of David, and king in Jerusalem. Now, of course, there could be a lot of kings that were descended from David, but the idea seems to be pretty clear that it's supposed to be Solomon. This particular king or preacher has vast, unmeasurably vast wealth. he can do anything he wants. He can give his life any kind of pleasure he desires. And this would fit Solomon, totally wealthy, an absolute monarch, no limits whatsoever on his power. And also he has great wisdom. So that, totally identifies with Solomon. In chapter 11, verse 1, there's a reference to maritime trade across ships. That was actually something that was pretty rare for the kingdom of Israel and Judah for most time periods, as they didn't have heavy concentrations of populations on any of the coast. But during Solomon's reign, he did enrich himself a great deal by that kind of trade. And finally, in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's an absence of any idea about resurrection from the dead or life after death. Now, later on, those ideas kind of come into to the biblical view, even into the Old Testament. But earlier on, there's not quite so much. And the author of Ecclesiastes seems to not be banking on anything like that. So that's, once again, an evidence for an earlier date for the book of Ecclesiastes. So here's the problem. The books of Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes are written in late biblical Hebrew. And I haven't in any of these videos gone into any great detail about the details of Hebrew, because I know I would lose almost all the viewers if I did. But it's not, sometimes it's kind of marginal whether the Hebrew is early or late, but in this case, it's really very clear. It seems to be late. It's not consistent with Solomon's time. And the most specific thing I can bring out, which any viewer could probably identify with, is the presence of Persian words in these books. Persian words are kind of a killer fact if you're trying to identify the date of the language, because there are no Persian words at all in any of the books that were clearly written before the exile. You can go through Genesis all the way through 2 Kings, and there's not even one Persian word. And that's because Israel really had no contact at all with Persia up until the day they became a province of Persia. And then their intense interaction with Persia. So that was 538 BC, after the exile. So that's kind of a good evidence for this being written after the exile. So now we have a contradiction. The internal evidence seems to point to the book being written in Solomon's time for both Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes. But the language seems to point to a later time. So here's a suggestion. Solomon's time would have been about 950 BC. The late Persian period would be about 400 BC. That's like 550 years later. It's a great deal of time later. During that period of time, language wasn't static. Language changed. And the Israelites were not necessarily really good at reading their sacred scriptures, particularly up until the time of the exile. You get to the revival under Josiah, and it's like they found a book of the law there in the temple, which was one of the books of the Torah, and they were so unfamiliar with it that, it's like nobody had even read it. And that was the law, the most important part of the law. So it's possible that maybe these books were written by Song of Solomon. They were kind of sort of buried and not really maintained very well. But then later they're picked up, but the language is so archaic and difficult to understand that what was done is you might be familiar with the syndrome of Shakespeare in modern English. If you try to read Shakespeare, it's kind of tough. But you can read Shakespeare in modern English. There are renditions of Shakespeare like that where the language has been updated. And so that may be a possibility. It may be that these books really were written by Solomon, but just the language was rather dramatically updated to bring it up to date in the late Persian period or Second Temple period. So I'm going to leave you on this one without a really definitive conclusion. That's the evidence that I see for both points of view, for Song of Solomon and for Ecclesiastes. So that's where I'm gonna leave this one. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to be back soon with one more video on dating the Old Testament.